The SS Waratah. In July 1909, a 500-foot passenger liner departed Durban, South Africa, bound for Cape Town. She carried 201 people, including passengers, crew, and cargo. The weather along the South African coastline was rough, but not unprecedented. Ships had navigated those waters for centuries. The SS Waratah was considered modern, well-built, and fully equipped. She was on her second voyage, which she never completed. No distress signal was ever received. No wreckage was recovered. No lifeboats were found. No bodies surfaced. A ship the length of a city block carrying over 200 people vanished from the face of the ocean without leaving a single recoverable trace. The last confirmed sighting occurred on July 26, 1909. The cargo ship Clan McIntyre spotted her off the Natal coast and exchanged signals. The Waratah appeared normal. She was on course. Nothing suggested distress. Within hours, she was gone. The Clan McIntyre herself encountered a violent storm shortly after. Her crew survived. The Waratah did not. Search operations began almost immediately. The Union Castle Line dispatched vessels. The British Royal Navy participated. Ships swept hundreds of miles of South African coastline for weeks. They found nothing. A second major search was launched in 1910. It returned empty. The ocean had swallowed the Waratah completely and offered no explanation. What makes this disappearance particularly difficult to rationalize is the ship's size. A vessel of 9,339 gross tons does not simply dissolve. Even ships that sink catastrophically leave debris fields, oil slicks, scattered cargo, floating timber, or personal effects. The Waratah left none of these. The absence of evidence was itself the anomaly. Investigators and engineers later raised questions about the ship's stability. Some argued she had a design flaw that made her prone to capsizing, a high center of gravity combined with poor righting ability in heavy seas. A passenger who disembarked in Durban before the final leg later testified that he had felt the ship behave strangely, rolling in a manner that made him uncomfortable enough to leave. His name was Claude Sawyer. He reportedly had a recurring vision of a figure holding a bloody sword. He disembarked and lived. Everyone who stayed did not. In 1999 and again in 2004, salvage teams using advanced sonar equipment conducted targeted searches along the South African coast. Both expeditions identified potential targets on the ocean floor. Both turned out to be other wrecks. The Waratah remained missing. The Agulhas current runs powerfully along that coastline. Some marine experts have suggested it could scatter debris far beyond normal search parameters. Others believe a rogue wave, a wall of water exceeding 100 feet, struck the ship without warning and drove her straight to the bottom within seconds, sealing everything inside. No theory has ever been confirmed. No wreck has ever been positively identified. The SS Waratah remains the largest passenger ship in history to vanish without a single piece of verified physical evidence. She is out there somewhere, waiting. The Carol A. Deering. On January 31, 1921, a 5-masted commercial schooner was spotted hard aground on Diamond Shoals off the coast of Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. The ship was visibly distressed. Her sails were set. Her anchors were down. No one responded to signals. A Coast Guard crew boarded her 2 days later when weather finally permitted approach. What they found inside has never been satisfactorily explained. The ship was abandoned, but the abandonment made no sense. Food was actively cooking on the stove. 2 meals were being prepared simultaneously, as if the crew had expected to eat within the hour. The table was partially set. Red lights, the international signal for distress, had been rigged in the ship's rigging, suggesting someone had anticipated danger. Yet the lifeboats were still aboard. The crew had not used them to leave, or if they had, the boats had been returned, which is equally inexplicable. The Carol A. Deering had departed Bath, Maine in 1920, bound for South America with a cargo load. She completed her delivery in Rio de Janeiro and was returning north. The last confirmed contact came from the Cape Lookout lightship on January 28, 1921. A crew member, described as not the captain, shouted across the water that the ship had lost both anchors. His behavior was noted as strange. The lightship operator attempted to relay the message by radio, but his equipment malfunctioned at that precise moment. When investigators boarded and searched the vessel, they found the ship's log missing. The navigation equipment was gone. The captain's and officers' personal belongings had been removed. The steering mechanism had been deliberately disabled. The anchor chain showed evidence of having been cut, not broken. These were not signs of panic. These were signs of something methodical. 10 crew members had been aboard. Not one was ever found. No bodies were recovered from the water. No survivors were located on shore. No witnesses came forward with credible accounts of seeing crew members disembark anywhere along the coastline. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in American maritime history. The State Department, the Treasury Department, the Justice Department, and the Commerce Department all became involved. Every theory was examined. Mutiny was considered. The fact that a non-officer had spoken to the lightship suggested the captain may have already lost control. Piracy was investigated, particularly in the context of Prohibition-era rum-running operations active in those waters. Paranormal theories emerged later, inevitably linking the site to the Bermuda Triangle. Despite Diamond Shoals falling outside its conventional boundaries, none of the official investigations produced a conclusion. The case was formally closed without resolution. The Carol A. Deering was eventually demolished in place as salvage was deemed impractical. Before demolition, one final search of the wreck recovered no additional evidence. The sea had kept its secret completely. A ghost ship implies a haunting. This was something more deliberate. 10 men vanished from a moving vessel in known waters in a documented time frame and left behind a warm stove and an unanswered question that has now persisted for over a century. Le Griffon. In August 1679, a 45-ton bark became the first European sailing vessel to navigate the upper Great Lakes. She was built under the direction of French explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, constructed near Niagara Falls using timber cut from the surrounding wilderness. Her construction alone was considered an engineering achievement in the context of frontier exploration. She was armed with 7 cannons. She flew the French flag. She was named Le Griffon after the mythological creature, half eagle and half lion, that appeared on the coat of arms of La Salle's patron, Count Frontenac. On September 18, 1679, Le Griffon departed from what is now Green Bay, Wisconsin, loaded with a valuable cargo of beaver pelts collected through trade with local indigenous nations. La Salle himself did not sail with her on this return leg. He remained behind with a small party to continue his expedition overland. He assigned a pilot, referred to in historical records only as Lucas, to navigate the ship back east toward Niagara. 6 crew members were aboard. The Griffon was never seen again. No wreckage was recovered. No crew members surfaced. No cargo was traced. The ship vanished somewhere within the vast interior of the Great Lakes system, and the precise location of that disappearance has never been established. La Salle waited at his post for weeks. When no ship came, he eventually continued his expedition on foot, later describing the loss as a devastating financial blow. The beaver pelts aboard were intended to fund the next phase of his exploration. The Great Lakes are notoriously unpredictable. Storms can develop rapidly, particularly in autumn. Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, both of which Le Griffon would have traversed, are capable of generating waves that can overwhelm small vessels with little warning. A sudden storm in September 1679 is the most widely accepted explanation among historians, but an explanation is not confirmation, and no physical evidence has ever supported it. What complicates the case further is the pattern of false discoveries that has followed Le Griffon for decades. In 2001, a couple of divers claimed to have located the wreck in northern Lake Michigan. In 2014, another team announced a similar discovery near Poverty Island. In 2018, yet another site was identified. Each claim generated significant attention. Each was subsequently challenged, disputed, or dismissed by archaeologists and historians, citing inconsistencies in construction, dimensions, or period-accurate materials. The search is further complicated by the age of the wreck. A wooden vessel submerged for over 3 centuries in freshwater deteriorates dramatically. Identification requires matching period construction techniques, fastening methods, and timber species against surviving historical descriptions, none of which are particularly detailed. What is not in dispute is the historical significance of the vessel. Le Griffon represents the earliest chapter of European maritime presence in the American interior. She predates the United States itself by nearly a century. She sits somewhere beneath those lakes, unclaimed, unconfirmed, and unnamed on any official record. The Great Lakes have claimed hundreds of ships. The Griffin remains the oldest and the most elusive among them. The Vasa. On August 10, 1628, the most expensive and elaborately decorated warship in the Swedish naval fleet set sail from Stockholm harbor. She had been under construction for 3 years. She carried 64 bronze cannons arranged across 2 gun decks, an ambitious design that was relatively uncommon for the era. She was adorned with over 700 carved wooden sculptures painted in vivid colors, intended to project the power and prestige of King Gustav II Adolf across the Baltic Sea. Thousands of Stockholm residents lined the waterfront to watch her depart. She sailed approximately 3,800 meters. A light gust of wind struck the Vasa as she moved through the harbor. She listed to one side, partially recovered, then listed again. Water entered through the open gun ports on her lower deck. She did not recover from the second lean. Within minutes, the Vasa sank into 32 meters of water, less than a mile from where she had launched. Between 30 and 50 people died. The most powerful warship in the Swedish Navy had lasted roughly 20 minutes. The question of how this happened has a clear answer rooted in physics and institutional failure. The Vasa was top-heavy. Her upper structure, 2 gun decks, heavy armament, and elaborate ornamentation sat far above her center of gravity. Her hull was not wide enough to provide the ballast necessary to counteract that weight distribution. A simple stability test conducted before departure, in which sailors ran back and forth across the deck to simulate rolling, was halted after just 3 passes because the ship moved too violently. The test was stopped. The ship sailed anyway. What makes this case a study in institutional failure, rather than simple incompetence, is the paper trail left behind. King Gustav II. Adolf had personally intervened in the ship's design, demanding the second gun deck be added after construction had already begun. Naval architects raised concerns. Those concerns were not elevated with sufficient force. The men with the knowledge to prevent the disaster lacked the authority or the courage to confront the men with the authority who lacked the knowledge. A formal inquiry was convened immediately after the sinking. Officers, builders, and crew members were questioned. No one was ultimately punished. Blame circulated without landing. The master shipbuilder, Henrik Hubertson, had died the previous year and was conveniently unavailable. The inquiry concluded without a verdict. The Vasa sat on the floor of Stockholm harbor for 333 years. She was rediscovered in the late 1950s by amateur archaeologist Anders Franzén, who had spent years searching historical records to locate her. In 1961, she was raised largely intact, preserved by the cold, low-salinity waters of the Baltic. She is now housed in a purpose-built museum in Stockholm and remains one of the best-preserved 17th-century vessels in the world. The wreck is not a mystery. The wreck is a warning. Every timber, every cannon, every carved figure that survived 3 centuries underwater tells the same story. Competence ignored in the presence of power produces catastrophe. The Vasa proved it in 20 minutes and has been proving it ever since. The USS Cyclops. In March 1918, a 542-foot United States Navy collier departed Barbados bound for Baltimore, Maryland. She carried 309 men and a cargo hold filled with manganese ore, a dense, heavy mineral used in wartime steel production. The USS Cyclops was one of the largest vessels in the American naval fleet at the time. She was not a combat ship, but she was critical to the war effort. She had been resupplying American and Allied forces across the Atlantic theater. She was experienced, crewed, and on a well-traveled route. No distress signal was ever transmitted. No wreckage was ever recovered. No bodies were found. The USS Cyclops vanished completely, taking 309 lives with her, the single largest non-combat loss of life in United States Navy history. The Cyclops departed Barbados on March 4, 1918. Her scheduled arrival in Baltimore was approximately 10 days later. She never arrived. When she failed to appear, the Navy initiated search operations across the Atlantic corridor. Nothing was found. No oil slick, no floating debris, no personal effects. The ocean returned nothing. What deepened the mystery was the condition of the ship before departure. In Barbados, the American consul inspected the Cyclops and filed a report noting significant irregularities. One of her two engines was non-functional, meaning she was operating at reduced power for the return voyage. Her cargo of manganese ore was documented as improperly loaded, unevenly distributed, in a way that would have affected the ship's trim and stability. The consul also noted that the commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander George Worley, was behaving erratically. Worley, it later emerged, had been born in Germany under the name Johann Friedrich Wichmann and had anglicized his identity years earlier. In the context of World War I, this detail attracted immediate and intense scrutiny. Theories multiplied rapidly. A German submarine attack was the first and most logical consideration. However, German naval records captured after the war contained no claim of sinking the Cyclops and no documentation of any engagement in that area during that period. The absence of a debris field also argued against a torpedo strike. A ship that size struck by a torpedo would have left wreckage. Structural failure due to the improperly loaded ore was proposed. Manganese ore is exceptionally dense. An uneven distribution could have fatally compromised the vessel's stability, particularly combined with a disabled engine in rough seas. Others suggested mutiny, citing the crew's reported dissatisfaction with Worley's command. Espionage theories pointed to Worley's German origins and the wartime context. President Woodrow Wilson himself commented on the disappearance, stating that the loss was beyond explanation. The Navy conducted an exhaustive investigation and reached no conclusion. The Cyclops remains the most studied and least explained disappearance in American naval history. Positioned within the geographic boundaries of the Bermuda Triangle, she became one of the foundational cases in that mythology. But the triangle explanation requires no engagement with the documented mechanical failures, the unstable cargo, the compromised command, and the wartime environment that surrounded her final voyage. She was a ship with multiple known vulnerabilities. She was also a ship that left no trace. Both things remain true simultaneously, and neither resolves the other. The Kaz Sekenun. On April 20th, 2007, a 9.8-meter catamaran was spotted drifting approximately 88 miles off the coast of Airlie Beach, Queensland, Australia. The vessel was moving under sail. No one was visible on deck. A rescue helicopter was dispatched. When responders approached and boarded the Kaz-2, what they encountered was not the scene of an emergency. It was the scene of an interruption. The engine was running. A laptop computer was open and operational. The radio was functioning. The table was set for a meal. Food was prepared. 3 life jackets, one for each man registered aboard, were still on the ship. The sail was deployed but damaged, caught in a configuration that suggested something had gone wrong with a rigging maneuver. There was no distress signal. There was no note. There was no sign of struggle, violence, or panic. The 3 men aboard were Derek Batten, age 56, and brothers Peter and James Tandy, age 69 and 58, respectively. They had departed Airlie Beach on April 15, 2007, for a leisure voyage along the Queensland coast. They were experienced sailors. Derek Batten, in particular, had significant offshore sailing experience. These were not novices on an unfamiliar vessel. They knew the boat and they knew the water. A search operation was launched immediately. Aircraft and vessels covered thousands of square miles of the Coral Sea. No bodies were recovered. No personal effects were found floating in the surrounding water. The 3 men had vanished as completely as if they had never existed. The official investigation conducted by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau examined every recoverable detail. The damage to the sails suggested the boat had been sailing on a broad reach when something interrupted normal operation. One theory proposed that all 3 men had gone onto the deck simultaneously to manage a sail or rigging problem. Perhaps a line had fouled or a sail had jammed, and a sudden lurch or wave had swept all 3 overboard at once. In that scenario, the boat would have continued sailing unmanned exactly as it was found. This theory is mechanically plausible. It does not fully account for the absence of any bodies in waters where currents and drift patterns were well understood. It also does not explain why 3 experienced sailors would all be on deck without life jackets during a maneuver simultaneously, with no one remaining below as a precaution. Other theories proposed a rogue wave, a sudden and catastrophic event that struck the boat without warning and swept the deck clean before anyone could react. Rogue waves in that region, while not common, are documented. A wave of sufficient size and angle could clear a deck in seconds. What the investigation could not resolve was the timeline. The laptop, the engine, the prepared meal. These suggested the men had been aboard and active very recently before the boat was found. The window between their last moments aboard and the discovery of the drifting vessel may have been extraordinarily short. The CAS-2 case remains officially unresolved. Three men on a modern vessel in documented waters with functioning equipment disappeared without transmitting a single signal. The ocean offered no body, no explanation, and no closure. The Bechamo. In October 1931, a Hudson's Bay Company cargo steamer became trapped in pack ice near Barrow, Alaska, during what was supposed to be a routine trading voyage along the Arctic coast. The Bechamo was a 322-ton vessel that had spent years navigating the demanding waters of the western Arctic, collecting furs from remote trading posts. Her crew had experience with difficult northern conditions. This season, however, the ice closed faster than anticipated. The ship was locked in place and could not break free. The Hudson's Bay Company made a decision. The crew would be evacuated by aircraft in two groups. Some were flown out immediately. A smaller party of 22 men remained behind in a makeshift camp on shore, waiting out the freeze and monitoring the vessel. Then, in November 1931, a violent blizzard struck the region. When the storm cleared, the crew emerged from their shelters and looked toward where the Bechamo had been sitting in the ice. She was gone. The assumption was immediate and logical. A ship that heavily iced in, battered by an Arctic blizzard, had almost certainly sunk. The company accepted the loss. The crew was evacuated. The Bechamo was written off. A few weeks later, a local hunter reported spotting the ship drifting approximately 45 miles from where she had been abandoned. She had not sunk. The blizzard had broken her free from the ice pack and set her loose on the Arctic Ocean, crewless and unguided. What followed was one of the most extraordinary drifting records in maritime history. Over the next 38 years, the Bechamo was sighted repeatedly by sailors, hunters, and indigenous communities across the Western Arctic. She was spotted in 1933 when a group of Inuit became temporarily trapped aboard her during a storm. She was seen again in 1934 and 1935, and intermittently through the following decades. Each time, observers found her still afloat, battered but structurally intact, drifting through some of the most punishing waters on Earth without power, crew, or anchor. Several attempts were made to board and reclaim her. In 1931, shortly after the first resighting, the captain himself located the vessel and boarded her, but deemed salvage impractical under the conditions. In subsequent years, other parties reached her and removed cargo, but no sustained effort to tow or reclaim the hull ever succeeded. The Arctic conditions consistently prevented it. The last confirmed sighting of the Bechamo occurred in 1969, 38 years after her abandonment. She was spotted frozen in ice off the Alaskan coast by a group of Inuit. After that, she was not seen again. In 2006, the Alaskan government formally launched an initiative to locate the wreck using modern sonar and search technology. The search yielded no confirmed result. The Bechamo has not been found. What the Bechamo represents in maritime history is singular. A steel-hulled cargo ship, unmanned and unguided, survived nearly 4 decades of Arctic conditions, pack ice, polar storms, sub-zero temperatures, and a complete absence of maintenance, and remained afloat long enough to become a documented phenomenon across an entire generation of Arctic seafarers. No one directed her, no one repaired her. She simply refused to sink. She is out there still, in all probability, resting on the floor of the Beaufort Sea, or possibly still drifting, locked in ice somewhere beyond the reach of modern search equipment. The Arctic has never confirmed her fate and has shown no indication that it intends to. The HMS Terror. In May 1845, 2 Royal Navy vessels departed England on one of the most ambitious Arctic expeditions in British history. The HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror were tasked with navigating the Northwest Passage, the long-sought Arctic route connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The expedition was commanded by Sir John Franklin, a veteran explorer with decades of Arctic experience. The ships carried 129 men, 3 years' worth of provisions, and the most advanced polar equipment available at the time. They were last seen by European witnesses in late July 1845, anchored to an iceberg in Baffin Bay, waiting for conditions to improve. They were never seen again. What happened over the following months and years was reconstructed painfully slowly through decades of search expeditions, recovered documents, and Inuit oral testimony. By 1846, both ships had become icebound in Victoria Strait near King William Island. Franklin himself died in June 1847. By April 1848, 24 men had died from causes that remained unclear. The surviving 105 men made a decision that has puzzled historians ever since. They abandoned both ships, which were still structurally intact, and attempted to walk south across the Arctic tundra toward the Canadian mainland. None of them survived. The HMS Erebus was located in 2014. The HMS Terror was found in September 2016 by the Arctic Research Foundation, resting in 24 meters of water in Terror Bay, an inlet on the southwest coast of King William Island. The name of the bay was not coincidental. Inuit communities had known of the ship's approximate location for generations. What the discovery revealed defied straightforward explanation. The Terror was remarkably well preserved. Windows were intact. Cabins were ordered and undisturbed. Dishes were stacked neatly in their storage positions. Drawers were closed. The ship showed none of the chaotic interior conditions typically associated with emergency abandonment. She looked less like a vessel that had been fled in desperation and more like one that had been carefully, deliberately put to rest. This preservation raised an immediate and serious question. If the crew had abandoned the Terror in April 1848 in a state of deterioration and desperation, why did the ship's interior reflect calm and order? Several researchers have proposed that a smaller party returned to the Terror after the initial abandonment. Perhaps survivors who turned back when the overland route proved impossible reboarded the ship and lived aboard her for an additional period before eventually dying or departing again. Inuit testimony collected in the 19th century described encounters with small groups of gaunt, struggling men near the ships long after the official abandonment date. Forensic analysis of remains recovered from King William Island had previously identified evidence of scurvy, starvation, lead poisoning, potentially from the expedition's tinned food supply, and hypothermia. The men had been in catastrophic physical condition, yet the ship they left behind was pristine. The disconnect between the state of the crew and the state of the vessel has never been resolved. The Terror kept her interior intact for 170 years, while the men who sailed her did not survive a single Arctic winter on foot. Whatever decisions were made in those final months, the ship outlasted every man aboard her and has yet to fully surrender their story. The Bellamica. In August 2006, Italian Coast Guard vessels responded to reports of a drifting yacht off the coast of Sardinia near the Gulf of Olbia. The vessel was a modern clipper-style yacht, visibly adrift and unresponsive to radio contact. When Coast Guard officers boarded her, they found the interior in a condition that has since resisted every attempt at rational explanation. Half-eaten meals were sitting on the table. Food remained in pots on the stove. Personal belongings were scattered throughout the cabin in the casual, undisturbed manner of people who had simply stepped away momentarily. There was no sign of struggle. There was no damage consistent with an emergency. The vessel was intact, functional, and completely abandoned. What distinguished the Bellamica from similar ghost ship cases was the specific collection of items found aboard. Detailed nautical charts of the North African coastline, specifically French language maps covering Egyptian and Libyan waters, were spread across the navigation table. A flag from Luxembourg was displayed on the vessel. The combination of French navigational materials, a Luxembourg flag, and an Italian coastal location created an immediate jurisdictional and investigative puzzle that authorities were not equipped to resolve cleanly. Italian Coast Guard investigators attempted to trace the vessel through standard maritime registration channels. The search produced nothing usable. The yacht's registration documents were either absent, incomplete, or inconsistent with any verifiable ownership record in European maritime databases. No registered owner could be identified. No nation claimed the vessel. Luxembourg, whose flag she flew, had no record of her in their maritime registry. Interpol was contacted. European law enforcement agencies were notified. The investigation expanded beyond Italian jurisdiction in an attempt to identify who had been aboard and where they had come from. Despite this, no owner was ever formally identified, and no crew member was ever located. The North African charts added a layer of speculation that investigators could not ignore. The geographic focus of the navigational materials, Egypt and Libya, suggested a voyage originating from or destined for that region. In 2006, the central Mediterranean was an active corridor for irregular maritime movement, including smuggling operations of various kinds. The presence of detailed regional charts for waters far removed from the ship's discovery location implied a planned route that was never completed. What made official conclusions difficult was the absence of any evidence directly supporting criminal activity. No contraband was recovered from the vessel. No weapons were found. No documentation linking the ship to any known operation, legal or otherwise, was discovered aboard. The investigators had a ghost ship with foreign maps, an unverifiable flag, half-consumed food, and no human beings. The Bella Mica was eventually taken into Italian custody. Formal attempts to locate her owner continued for a period before the case stalled without resolution. No individual or organization ever came forward to claim the vessel or explain her presence in those waters. She remains one of the few modern maritime mysteries in which the vessel itself, the flag she flew, the charts she carried, and the people who sailed her all point in different directions simultaneously. Every detail aboard the Bella Mica suggested a story. None of those details were ever assembled into one: the Orang Medan. Sometime in the late 1940s, distress signals were picked up by multiple vessels crossing the Strait of Malacca, one of the busiest and most strategically significant shipping corridors in the world. The signals originated from a Dutch freighter called the Orang Medan. The message received in Morse code was among the most disturbing transmissions ever recorded in maritime history. All officers, including captain, are dead lying in chart room and on bridge, possibly whole crew dead. A second shorter message followed, then a final transmission consisting of a single broken phrase, "I die." After that, silence. Two American vessels, the Silver Star and a second ship whose identification varies across historical accounts, triangulated the signal and located the Orang Medan drifting in the strait. Boarding parties were dispatched. What they found when they crossed onto the deck has never been explained by any conventional framework. Every crew member was dead. They were found throughout the ship, on the bridge, in the communications room, across the deck, and below in the cargo hold. The bodies showed no signs of physical injury, no wounds, no bruising, no evidence of violence or struggle. But their expressions and their postures were what unsettled the boarding parties most profoundly. The men were described as frozen in attitudes of absolute terror, faces contorted, eyes open and upturned toward the sky, arms partially raised as though shielding themselves from something directly above. Even the ship's dog was found dead, lips pulled back in a silent snarl. The temperature aboard was noted as unusually cold despite the tropical heat of the surrounding environment. The boarding crew reported a distinct and overwhelming sense of dread upon entering certain sections of the vessel, particularly near the cargo hold. Before any formal investigation could be initiated, fire broke out in the cargo hold. The fire spread rapidly and with unusual intensity. The boarding parties evacuated. Shortly after, the Orang Medan exploded and sank, taking every body, every piece of evidence, and any possibility of physical examination to the bottom of the strait. The theories that followed have occupied researchers for decades. The most scientifically grounded explanation centers on the cargo. Some investigators have proposed that the Orang Medan was secretly transporting undeclared chemical agents, specifically potassium cyanide or nitroglycerin, or a combination of unstable compounds under falsified manifests. Exposure to leaking chemical cargo in an enclosed space could produce rapid asphyxiation and neurological effects consistent with the described facial expressions and the intense fire that destroyed the vessel. The secrecy surrounding the cargo would explain why no official manifest was ever produced. Others have pointed to carbon monoxide poisoning from a malfunctioning boiler system, which can kill without visible physical trauma and can produce physiological effects that contort facial muscles posthumously. What no theory has fully addressed is why one crew member survived long enough to transmit the distress signal, how he transmitted it with such coherence if the crew was already dying around him, and what he meant by the final phrase. The Orang Medan does not appear in Lloyd's shipping register. No Dutch maritime records have confirmed her existence. No wreck has ever been located. She may have been a real ship operating under falsified registration, a vessel deliberately kept off official records due to her cargo. Or the entire account may be an elaborate fabrication that entered maritime folklore through a series of magazine articles published in the early 1950s. What remains is the transmission, two words at the end of a dying man's final message, sent into open water, received by strangers, and never answered. If these stories of the deep have changed the way you look at the vast, silent horizon, then subscribe to our channel and like this video. We are unearthing the history that the tides tried to wash away. Help us navigate the unknown. Our next discovery is already surfacing.